Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So, this is a continuation of our discussion because last time we discussed the information processing theory, the process of how we learn through the um, environment, how we allow it to enter our senses. And once we give attention doon sa mga information, it will go to our short-term or working memory. And then if we were able to process it more, then it will go to our long-term memory. And once we were able to master that information, nagkakaroon pa tayo ng cognitive control. Yan. So now we are going to talk about Robert Gagne's cognition, ano ba to? Conditions of learning. Yeah. So allow me to share my screen. All right. So I do hope that you can now see my screen. Maximize lang natin. All right. So again, we pronounce this as Gagne. Okay, hindi siya Gagne. Diba? Pero pwede rin kung trip mong Gagne. But the correct pronunciation is Gagne's conditions of learning. Yeah. So just a few information about the proponent, Robert. Ang main idea niya dito sa conditions of learning niya is to actually allow students to learn, to check na talagang sila ay natututo kahit na nandoon yung idea ng individual differences. Kasi dito sa conditions of learning niya, these are complete sa kanya, no? Because there are 9 events and there are different categories of learning na sa tingin niya, kahit na nandoon yung konsepto ng individual differences, matututo yung mga bata. Actually, this conditions of learning na contributed o prinopose ni Gagne, actually malaking tulong siya sa ating mga teachers, lalo na sa paggawa natin ng lesson plan. When we plan to do our lessons or how are we going to design our lessons. So, to sum up the idea of Robert Gagne, ito siya. Okay? So there are 5 categories of learning such as verbal information, intellectual skills, cognitive strategies, attitudes, and motor skills. And for the instructions, there are 9 events. Okay? So moving forward, in designing instruction sa ating mga teachers, so from that 5 categories of learning, these are the 9 steps that we can actually apply in designing our lessons. Okay, so from gaining attention, informing the learner of the objectives, stimulating recall of prior learning, presenting the stimulus, providing learner guidance, eliciting performance, giving feedback, assessing performance, and lastly, enhancing retention and transfer. And again, there are 9 events of instruction sa conditions of learning ni Robert Gagne. Right? So, what are the principles of Gagne's idea of learning? So, first is, different instruction is required for different learning outcomes. Siyempre, hindi naman lahat ng lessons natin, pare-pareho yan ng instruction. It depends on what needs to be acquired and what needs to be yung gusto nating maging product sa mga bata. Okay? So events of learning operate on the learner in ways that constitute the conditions of learning. Number 3, the specific operations that constitute instructional events are different for each different type of learning outcome. Gaya ng sabi natin kanina, depende doon sa lesson and depende doon sa outcome na gusto nating makuha. So, it needs different instructions, syempre. And lastly, learning hierarchies define what intellectual skills are to be learned and the sequence of instruction. Yan. So let's now look at the conditions of learning. So there are 5. Okay, kanina. But let's look first for the conditions of learning. Sa conditions of learning, there are 2 types, internal condition and external condition. Pag sinabi nating internal, it's within the learner. Okay? Internal. Kaya nga siya internal. It's already existing within you. So these are your capabilities that already exist in a learner before any new learning begins. Another external condition. External condition naman, it includes different stimulus that exist outside the learner. Ayan, tanggalin niyo na lang yung letter S. Sobrang dumami. That's the stimulus that exists outside. So basically, sa external conditions, these are your environmental factors, lahat ng hindi existing sa inyo within. Ayan. So now let's look at the 5 categories of learning outcomes. Number 1 is the verbal information. So verbal information is being able to state ideas. Okay, so verbal nga eh. So basically you can say it. Okay, so knowing that or having declarative knowledge. Yung mga bagay na pwede nating ulitin, sabihin. Yan. So this refers to the organized bodies of knowledge that we acquire. Pag sinabi nating acquire, these are the information that we receive and that we are able to process and may kakayahan tayong i-retrieve. Okay? So they may be classified as names, facts, principles, and generalizations. Okay, so these are called verbal information. Next, intellectual skills. Sa intellectual skills naman, so intellect is our ability to actually explain it on a step-by-step process. So procedural, so knowing how. It's your intellectual skills that involve the use of symbols such as numbers, language, to interact with the environment. So they involve knowing how to do something. So pag sinabing intellectual skills, more of the procedures. Or pag sinabi natin procedures, this is the step-by-step process. Paano nangyayari? Okay? Number 3, no pala, sorry. Before we move on to number 3, we have to consider 5 subcategories under intellectual skills. Kasi since this is all about processes, ayan, so merong mga i-consider tayo. Number 1 is discrimination. Pag sinabi nating discriminate, this is your ability to distinguish one feature of an object or symbol from another. It includes your ability to distinguish texture, letters, numbers, shapes, and sounds. So distinguish is the clue natin dyan when we talk about discriminations. Another, concrete concepts. Sa concrete concepts naman, since this is our concrete, ibig sabihin specific siya sa isang object or sa isang concept. Yan. So this is your ability to identify a class of objects or object quality relations by pointing out one or more examples or instances of the class. And so later, we will have more examples of these subcategories. Okay, number 3, sa subcategory ng intellectual skill is the defined concept. Pag sinabi nating defined concept, it's your ability to define both general and relational concepts by providing instances of a concept to show its definition. So basically, ito yung kakayanan ng isang learner na i-explain or i-define sa sarili niyang pamamaraan yung isang concept o yung isang information based doon kung paano niya ito naunawaan. Okay? Another is rules. It's learned capability of the learner by making it possible for the learner to do something rather than just stating something. Sa rules naman, this is now your ability to somehow apply what you have learned or what you have acquired. Okay? So, di ba sa rules, you can now do it on your own. So, may action na siyang naka-include. Okay? And lastly, higher order rules. Higher order rule naman, it's the process of combining rules by learning into more complex rules used in problem solving. So there are now considerations, limitations, boundaries na i-incorporate or i-integrate na natin kung paano natin naunawaan ng isang bagay. Okay? So moving on to the categories of learning, we have the cognitive strategy. So cognitive strategy or strategies, it's having certain techniques of thinking, ways of analyzing problems, and having approaches to solving problems. So it refers to the process that learners guide their learning, remembering, and thinking. Okay? So it's more on how you acquire and how you now retrieve concepts, ideas, and information. Number 4, attitudes. So sa attitudes, these are mental states that influence the choices of personal actions. So attitude, it's actually somehow subjective. Okay, so it's an internal state that influences the choices of personal actions made by an individual towards some class of things, persons, or events. Okay, and lastly, motor skills. So, syempre, motor. Ang ginagawa kapag motor skills, kapag sinabi nating motor, it's basically dapat ang motor umaandar, di ba? So, it's more about executing movements, actions. That's why it's called motor. Okay? This will now require you to apply into action yung natutunan. So, executing movements in a number of organized motor acts such as playing sports or driving a car. So, these are precise, smooth, and accurately timed executions of movements involving the use of muscles. They are a distinct type of learning outcome and necessary to the understanding of the range of possible human performances. Yeah. So, this is your ability to now act it out. Okay, di ba? Sa mga, for example, di ba, sa isang concept, di ba, ginagawa ng teacher, how to apply them is, sige nga, mag-role play kayo, sige nga, let's do it as a return demo. For example, those are motor skills. Yung ability na ng estudyante o ng learner na gawin na niya in return kung ano yung mga natutunan niya. Okay? So to sum up, okay, the categories of learning and to align it to the conditions of learning of Gagne. Okay? So first yung verbal information. So paano siya dinidesign kapag sa paggawa ng lesson plan? So verbal information, okay, ang example niyan is yung review of lesson. So every time na si teacher is papasok sa classroom, hindi agad dapat pasok na ng lesson na bago. Okay? So it is very important to review the previous lesson para may continuation. If you can recall the Gestalt psychology, dapat may law of continuity. So parang ito yan sa review of lesson. So aalalahanin natin, like for example, we are talking about Gagne's conditions of learning ngayon. So prior to this, we have talked about information processing theory. Kasi doon, in-explain ng information processing theory yung way natin na makapag-store ng information. And in that way, we were able to recall, retrieve. So, meron tayong idea kung paano tayo nag-acquire ng knowledge through memory. Okay? So that's an example of review of lesson. So sa conditions of learning, it draws attention to distinctive features by variation in print of speech. And it presents information so that it can be made into chunks. So it's also a way to provide a meaningful context for effective encoding of information and provide cues of effective learning. Ayan, nahulog na yung learning dyan. Ayan. So again, before you start a new lesson, it's very important to have a review of the previous lesson for continuation. So that's verbal information. Next naman, intellectual skills. So sa intellectual skills, may subcategories. Nandun si discrimination, concrete, concept, defined concepts, rules, and higher order rules. Yung nabanggit natin kanina. So ano yung example na gagawin nito if it's going to be applied sa instruction. Yan. So, sa discrimination, yung sabi natin, distinguishing objects or symbols. So, example, sa previous lesson, or how do you define odd and even numbers? O sige nga, magbigay ng example ng odd numbers. How about even numbers? Ganon. Concrete concepts, identifying classes of concrete objects. So, for example, magre-review kayo ng lesson and then you're going to provide an example. Sige nga, ihiwalay mo nga yung red na mga objects, okay, na nandito sa loob ng ating bowl. So, for example, yung bowl mo, iba't ibang kulay yung nandun. Pero, ang instruction mo is, ihiwalay lang yung red. Okay, so, ang expectation doon is, kung talagang nagkaroon ng acquisition of knowledge yung bata, kaya niyang ihiwalay lahat ng red lang. Okay, that's because that's your instruction. Okay, so concrete concept ang tawag doon. Another naman, rules. Sa rules, this is applying a concept. So for example, computation. Okay. So sige nga, alalahanin nga natin yung formula for computing parameter. Sasabihin mo. And since parameter lang naman is adding all the sides of a polygon, ganyan. So, yung idea ng bata, lahat bibigyan mo lang siya ng value per side. And then, the student will be able to compute it properly. Okay? Higher order rules is applying a new combination of rules to solve a complex problem. So, an example nun is, of course, you are going to generate a balance. For example, hayaan mo na siya. O sige nga, given, for example, magko-compute tayo, no? So, sige nga, ito yung allowance na ibibigay sa'yo. So, how are you going to allot, okay, money sa lahat ng pangangailangan mo? So, higher order rules. So, it includes now the strategy, yung values ng estudyante. Okay? Basta bibigyan kita ng 10 piso and i-budget mo ito for 2 days, for example, ganun. So, bahala siya kung paano niya i-apply yon. Basta dapat yung instruction na sunod and then dapat ma-budget niya. May tamang allocation yung paglalagay niya ng budget, for example. Okay? So, sa conditions of learning, these intellectual skills will call attention to distinctive features. So, makikita na natin that the student will learn, okay, distinctively. So, it will stay within the limits of working memory. So, short-term lang daw pala siya, no? Stimulate the recall of previously learned component skills, and it presents verbal cues to the ordering or combination of competent skills and schedules occasions for practice and spaced review. And lastly, it use a variety of context to promote transfer. So, since lahat ng na-recall lang naman pala ng isang estudyante from the previous lesson, lahat lang daw nagsistay sa short-term memory in order to have it go beyond. Okay. And it will go to the long-term memory, hopefully, is yung magkaroon ng rehearsal or practice. Yun. Sa cognitive strategies naman, so paano natin siya i-design sa instructional or sa lesson plan natin? So this is employing personal ways to guide learning, thinking, acting, and feeling. Ano yung example na pwede natin gamitin sa cognitive strategy? So for example, concept map of topic being studied. So sige nga, what are the concepts na naaalala nyo when it comes to, when we talk about Gestalt? No, sabihin mo ganon. So, sige nga, anong mga konseptong naalala nyo pag sinabi nating Piaget, o kaya Freud, o kaya Tolman, or Bandura, magbibigay na yan ng iba't ibang concepts. So, the conditions of learning here is to describe or demonstrate the strategy and provide a variety of occasions for practice using the strategy and provide informative feedbacks as to the creativity of the strategy or outcome. Kasi we have ways of, inputting schema sa ating mga utak, how we can recall ideas or information. Okay, so that's why it's called cognitive strategies. Okay, and lastly, attitudes. So attitudes, these are, for example, how are we going to design it in your lesson plan? Choosing a personal action based on internal states of understanding and feelings. Okay, so it will now include subject integration. magkakaroon na ng integration, for example, ng values. So, may mga tanong minsan ang teacher na ganito, o sige nga, magbigay ka nga ng experience mo, based on your experience. Sige nga, ano yung mga bagay na sa tingin mo ay magtatanong about your current lesson? So sige nga, paano mo nga i-apply yung concept ni Gagne about your past experiences? Say, for example, your senior high school life, meron bang idea na nakita mo na i-apply itong topic na ito? O yung mga ganon. So, in that way, you will be able to at least make it personal. So, sa bata, pwede palang i-share yung mga experiences ko. Ito pala. So, in that way, parang nagiging contextualize, nalolocalize din yung topic. Okay? So, mas naiintindihan niya kasi na-apply na niya sa sarili niya. Okay? And the conditions of learning here, according to Gagne, is it will establish an expectancy of success associated with the desired attitude. It will assure student identification with an admired human model. It will arrange communication or demonstrations of choice of personal action, and it give feedback for successful performance or allow observation of feedback in the human model. So dahil mas personal yung tanong mo doon sa bata, kasi based on his or her experience, so mas naaalala niya. So mas maaalala niya yung idea na yan dahil meron naman pala siyang personal encounter doon sa inyong pinag-aaralan. Okay, and lastly, motor skills. Siyempre, sabi nga natin, motor kailangan, hindi lang puro ideas, hindi lang puro pag-alala. Okay, based on what the learner has experienced. Pero dapat yan, mai-apply niya in action. So this will now, sa design natin sa lesson plan, kailangan magkaroon ng performance. Okay? Outcome-based siya. So sige, for your activity, ganun yung gagawin ni teacher. For your activity, kindly interview. O kaya, kindly make a lesson plan that will show Gagne's conditions of learning. Ganon. So, doing the steps of tinikling dance, for example, yung mga return demonstration natin or performance task natin sa PE. That's motor skills. Di ba ituturo muna sa inyo ano yung steps, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3. And then step 1, step 2, step 3, tatayo kayo, i-execute nyo yan. So, ganun lang din siya. So, in order for the teacher, of course, to see kung lahat ng concept and ideas na yan, kaya mo siyang gawin kapag ipinabalik or ipina-review na sa'yo yung concept. Okay? So, ang condition ng learning dyan, it will present verbal or other guidance to cue the executive subroutine. It will arrange repeated practice. It will furnish immediate feedback as to the accuracy of performance and encourage the use of mental practice. Okay? So, dahil nga gagawin mo siya, kailangan maalala mo siya paulit-ulit. Alright? So, moving forward, so there are 9 events of instruction na inire-require dito sa conditions of learning ni Gagne. Okay? So, these will be now applied to your lesson planning. Okay? First is gaining attention. Number 2, informing the learner of the objectives. Number 3, stimulating recall of prior learning. 4, presenting the stimulus. 5, providing learner guidance. 6, eliciting performance. Next is giving feedback. 8 is assessing performance. And 9 is enhancing retention and transfer. So, isa-isahin natin. So, if you're going now to design a lesson plan, so for example, gagawa na kayo ng lesson plan and you will soon will do lesson plan. Hindi ko alam kung gumagawa na talaga kayo ng lesson plan. Pero ito yung i-consider nyo. Pag ito yung kinonsider nyo, actually, if you're going to follow Gagne's conditions of learning, actually magiging super perfect na yung paggawa nyo ng lesson planning kapag mag-4th year na kayo o mag-3rd year na kayo. So, yan. Isa-isahin natin. Number 1, gain attention of the students. Sa gaining of attention, sa pag-design ng lesson plan, how do you gain attention from the student? Siyempre, ito yung mga motivation. Ito yung mga pa-icebreaker ni teacher. Diba? So, anong gagawin? So, di ba sa lesson planning or sa step-by-step procedure on how you will teach sa klase is prayer, ayan, and then giving class rules, very important. And then, next is gaining attention of the students. Okay? So, gaining attention, for example, you will prepare a dance routine. Sige, tayo nga tayong lahat. Ayan, gaining attention of the students. Tayo nga tayong lahat para mabuhay naman yung mga katawang lupa natin kahit mainit ang panahon. Mga paganyan ng teacher. O, tayo po tayo. Ayan, sayawin natin ang chicken dance. O, yun. That will now gain attention of the students. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, informing students of the objectives. Sige. So, ang susunod dyan, sige, yan, salamat. Maraming salamat sa inyong participation. Nakita ko na lahat nabuhayan, ano? So, upo na tayong lahat. Okay? Kasi ngayong umagang ito, ngayong hapon na ito, ngayong araw na ito, the objectives of the lesson that we are going to tackle are the following. Ito. So, ang objective, basically, syempre, kailangan niya nandoon ang cognitive, affective, and motor. Okay? So, i-discuss yan further natin sa ating mga susunod na lessons. But again, cognitive, of course, it's all about your knowledge. Affective is more on emotions. And then, psychomotor or motor is syempre action. Diniscuss natin kanina. Alright. So, once you have already informed your students, number 3, okay, you will now stimulate recall of prior learning. So, dito yung review. May pa-review ka na naman. Ha? So, before you now introduce the lesson, kailangan merong recall. So, sabi natin sa recall, this is a review. Okay? Because this will help students make sense of the new information. Hindi yung, ano ba yung sinasabi ni teacher? Ano ba sinasabi ni ma'am? Ganyan. Kailangan idugtong mo siya dun sa bagong information o bagong topic na i-introduce mo. And in that way also, para hindi ma-decay, okay? Hindi magkaroon ng forgetting doon sa before na lesson, yung prior lesson. Kailangan magkakasunod, magkakadugtong. Okay? And then, once you were able to review the lesson, sige nga, anong mga natutunan natin? Di ba ganyan, may paganyan si teacher. Sige nga, alalahanin nga natin. Tapos, tatawag ka randomly. Okay? Para maalala at ma-recall, o nga, last time pala na-discuss natin yung ganito. Okay. And then, kapag nagkaroon na ng recall, ayan, thank you very much. Always give feedback. Okay, thank you very much for our giving right answers. O yan, tama. Lahat ng sinabi nyo tama. Okay? So, hindi nagtatapos doon yung lesson natin because now we are going to continue with the topic ganito. Okay, you're present now. You present now your new information or your new lesson. Okay? So, in presenting new lesson, pwedeng may mga pa-surprise kayo dyan. Okay? Pwedeng merong kayong mga pa-box. Yun yung mga nakikita ko sa mga ate and kuya nyo na nagde-demo eh. So, merong kayong box, tapos bubunutin yung mga bata. And then, bawat mabunot, you explain. O pwede din yung mga IMs or instructional materials nyo, nakasulat-sulat doon. And then, ipapasagot mo doon sa mga bata, yung mga cues. Okay? So, pwedeng nandoon yung mga word puzzle, o sige nga, yung mga rumble-rumble na letters doon. Bubuuin nila. And that is one way of introducing, of course, your content. Okay. And then, now you provide learning guidance. Siyempre, hindi mo naman basta na lang iiwanan. It's just, hindi pwedeng parang tertiary, sa atin kasi dito sa colleges. Okay, read 135 to 140 and do the activity. Yun, pwede yun. But for high school and elementary, you cannot do that. Okay, you have to provide learning guidance. Paano si guidance? Dapat malinaw ang instruction. Okay, so advise your students of strategies to aid them in learning content and the resources available. So methods to provide learning guidance include provide instructional support as needed. Okay? Unang-una na dapat dyan is maganda yung instruction or your directions kung paano mauunawaan. Kailangan sunod-sunod yung concept. Okay? So model varied learning strategies. Use examples and non-examples. So hanggat maaari, you localize your example kapag nagbibigay kayo ng topic. And then provide case studies. O kaya minsan maganda yung may patrivia ka. Okay? Dahil mga uso yung mga pachismis natin. Mas gusto ng bata yan. And of course, kung kailangan ng um, real life na example o makakapagdala ka para lang makita ng bata yung lesson o yung topic na dinidiscuss mo in a real life. Okay? Meron ka talagang um, dala-dala. Mas maganda. Okay? Example, ang topic natin ngayon is um, mag, uh, mag, magre-relleno tayo ng bangus. Yan, for example. O kaya, mag-learn tayo about Scrabble. Yan. So, syempre, yung mga walang idea about pagre-relleno ng bangus, kung hindi pa naman nakakita talaga ng isda yan, dapat magdala ka ng isda na buhay. Kung kinakailangan, dun mo na rin pukpukin. And then, yung process, yung step-by-step process on how to do the pagre-relleno. And kapag naman sa pag-Scrabble, dapat meron ka namang dala dapat na board ng Scrabble and the parts, yung materials needed for Scrabble. Ganon. Okay? Next, elicit performance. Now, you practice. Ito na yung mga activities na binibigay na ng teacher. Okay? So yan, so since nakita na ninyo kung paano ko pinaliskisan ang bangus. So for example, ganyan ang topic mo. Now you can now do it on your own. Sige nga, maggrupo nga tayo. Igrupo ko kayo ng 3 and I will give you 30 minutes to do it on your own. And then you will show it in class afterwards. Okay. O sige nga, since I was able to teach you now how to play Scrabble. Sige nga, meron akong ibibigay na word sa inyo. Okay, and you will now play Scrabble with your group mates. And I will give you 3 minutes for this. Ganon. So that's eliciting performance or practice. Okay? And next to that will be providing feedback. Okay? So nagbigay na ng presentation yung bata, ipinakita na nila kung paano nila naunawaan yung topic for today, and then you will give feedback. If the presentation or the performance is not that good, be honest. Okay? Huwag kayong matakot na sabihin dun sa bata na anak, hindi tama. Okay? Lalo na kapag performance task yung hinihingi, mas maganda maging honest tayo. For example, I have this previous observation. Ito lang. So as I can recall, PE yung demonstration, and then isa-isa niyang pinapatayo yung mga estudyante to perform do yung step na pinakita niya. Magsasample siya tapos hihingin niya yung sample ng bata. And then I saw na doon sa feedback talaga hindi niya pa uupuin yung buong group kapag merong nakikita siyang nagkakamali. So in that way, nakikita niya na hindi maganda yung performance. So nako-correct niya. So hindi uupo yung bata na mali yung ginagawa niya. And I actually commend him for that na doon pa lang sa pagpapa-perform na niya doon sa estudyante, real time, nasabi niya na hindi tama. So ito yung tama. So umupo yung bata na alam niya kung paano yung tama. So that's one way of giving proper feedback. And of course, for proper feedback, nandun din yung proper way of saying feedback. Okay, if it's a very, very good performance, you say very good. Okay, napakahusay. O kaya yung ginagawa naman ng mga elementary teachers na yung nagpapapalakpak. Even for high school. Because, when you provide a feedback that is very good, it will elicit parang rehearsal. Magkakaroon yung bata ng idea na ulit-ulitin yung gagawin. Kasi nakakuha siya ng magandang feedback. Yun yung palakpak lamok, yung mga ganyan, yung very good clap, o kaya you say very good. Pag minsan naman may pa-reward, may pa-candy, may pa-chocolate, may pa-Gcash, may pa-roleta, kung ano-ano. It's one way of giving feedback. Of course, not all feedback are good feedback. So, we call the negative, of course, constructive feedback. Sa constructive feedback naman, it's your opportunity to do better next time. Okay? So, number 8 is assess performance. So, for assessing performance, this is in order to evaluate the effectiveness of the instructional events, you must test to see if the expected learning outcomes have been achieved. So, sa performance, hindi lang siya natatapos sa activity within the classroom. Kailangan, meron kang pa-assignment. Okay? May pa-assignment ka na gagawin and then you provide the rubric paano i-scorean. And then you assess. Dun sa performance na ibinigay ng bata or binigay niya sa yung output, i-assess mo kung natuto ba yung estudyante o hindi. And lastly, enhance retention and transfer. This is to help learners develop expertise and they must internalize new knowledge. Okay, so enhancing retention is, of course, allowing them to repeat and allowing them to show what they have learned doon sa inyong topic or activity. Okay? So, yan. Again, for your group activity, you are going to create a lesson plan that will, of course, show the events of instructions based on Gagne's conditions of learning. So, create or you have to select a lesson and then dun sa per event of instruction, maglalagay kayo ng example. Okay? So, it will be same grouping. Okay? And for the submission, of course, you can submit it in our FB Social Learning. For questions about our topic, you can actually send it or you can use our group chat for clarifications. So thank you very much and God bless us all.